Rice. Rice, one of the most basic, universally healthy foods on the planet, quietly absorbs roughly 10 times more arsenic from soil and water than other grains. This happens because rice is grown flooded in paddies, and that growing method pulls naturally occurring soil arsenic directly into the grain. Brown rice concentrates even more of it than white, since arsenic accumulates specifically in the outer bran layer that white rice has already had removed. The FDA's own risk assessment found no acute danger for the general adult population, but did flag real concern for infants and young children. Cooking rice like pasta, in excess water that gets drained afterward, removes 40 to 60% of the arsenic content, a simple, nearly free fix. This is one of the few items on this list where the concern is genuinely real, not overblown, just manageable with one small change. White rice varieties like basmati and jasmine, along with rice grown in California, consistently test lower in arsenic than rice grown in the southern United States. Rinsing rice before cooking barely reduces arsenic at all, despite being the most commonly recommended fix online. Soaking or the boil and drain method work far better. Canned foods. Many canned foods are lined with a BPA-based epoxy resin to prevent the metal can from reacting with the food inside. BPA is a well-studied endocrine disruptor, and acidic or fatty canned foods, tomatoes especially, can leach measurably more of it into the food. Manufacturers have increasingly moved to BPA-free linings, though some replacements use structurally similar chemicals with less long-term research behind them. Choosing fresh, frozen, or glass-packaged versions of these same foods when practical sidesteps the issue entirely. A 2023 analysis found detectable BPA in the majority of canned food samples tested, though concentrations varied enormously between brands and food types. Bottled water. A widely cited 2024 study using more sensitive detection methods found hundreds of thousands of plastic particles in the average liter of bottled water. Many of these are nanoplastics, small enough to potentially cross into the bloodstream, though what that means for long-term health is still being actively researched. Tap water isn't microplastic-free either, just measurably lower in most studies, since the plastic often comes from the bottle and cap rather than the water source. Switching to a reusable filtered container is a low-cost way to meaningfully cut this exposure regardless of how the research ultimately settles. The same detection method applied to tap water found roughly 10 to 100 times fewer particles on average, though results varied significantly by location. Farmed salmon. Farmed salmon's signature pink color doesn't happen naturally in captivity. It comes from a synthetic pigment called astaxanthin added directly to their feed. Without it, farm-raised salmon would actually come out pale gray, since they don't eat the wild shrimp and krill that color wild salmon naturally. Farmed salmon has also been found to carry higher concentrations of certain industrial contaminants like PCBs tied to their feed and living conditions. None of this makes salmon unsafe to eat regularly, but it's a good example of a healthy food externally altered in ways most people never think to ask about. This same astaxanthin pigment is naturally produced by algae and is also sold as a human supplement, so its presence isn't inherently the concerning part. Wild-caught salmon avoids both the added pigment and the higher contaminant levels at a meaningfully higher price point for most consumers. Almonds and tree nuts. Almonds and other tree nuts are vulnerable to a mold-produced toxin called aflatoxin, one of the most potent naturally occurring carcinogens known. This mostly becomes a real risk with improper storage, especially warm, humid conditions that let mold flourish on nuts sitting too long. Regulatory agencies in most developed countries test for and enforce strict aflatoxin limits on commercial nut supplies. Buying from reputable brands and storing nuts properly, cool and dry, essentially eliminates this risk for most consumers. Peanuts, corn, and certain spices face similar aflatoxin monitoring requirements. This isn't an almond-specific issue so much as a broader stored crop one. Tuna and large fish. Large, long-lived predator fish like tuna, swordfish, and shark accumulate mercury from everything smaller they've eaten over their entire lifetime. This is well established enough that health agencies issue specific weekly consumption limits, especially for pregnant women and young children. Smaller, shorter-lived fish like sardines and salmon accumulate dramatically less mercury, while providing similar nutritional benefits. This is a genuine, well-documented risk, but one that's about frequency and fish selection, not avoiding fish altogether. The FDA and EPA jointly recommend 2 to 3 servings of low-mercury fish per week, while limiting high-mercury choices like tuna steaks to about once weekly. Conventionally raised meat. Much conventionally raised livestock receives routine antibiotics, and regulatory limits exist for residue in the meat that reaches your plate, and measured levels are typically far below levels shown to cause direct harm. The bigger, more scientifically supported concern is actually antibiotic resistance developing in bacteria from widespread livestock antibiotic use. This is a case where the headline fear, hormones in your steak, is less supported than the quieter, more complicated real concern behind it. The European Union has banned growth hormones in beef production entirely since 1989, while the United States still permits certain hormones under regulated conditions. Oats. Oats are often sprayed with the herbicide glyphosate shortly before harvest to dry the crop out evenly, leaving trace residue in many commercial oat products. The World Health Organization's pesticide panel, the EPA, and the European Food Safety Authority have all concluded glyphosate is unlikely to pose a cancer risk at food levels. One body, the IRC, did classify it as a probable carcinogen, using a hazard-based method that doesn't account for actual real-world exposure levels. Choosing oat products labeled organic is a reasonable precaution if this disagreement concerns you, even though most regulators consider typical exposure levels acceptable. Glyphosate is actually one of the most extensively studied pesticides in existence, with decades of toxicology data informing these regulatory conclusions. Broccoli and cruciferous vegetables. Broccoli, kale, and other cruciferous vegetables contain natural compounds called goitrogens, which can interfere with how the thyroid absorbs iodine. This is real chemistry, but the effect only becomes meaningful at extreme intake. One documented case involved someone eating 3 pounds of raw bok choy daily. Cooking deactivates most of the relevant enzyme, and for anyone with adequate iodine intake, normal cooked servings show no meaningful thyroid impact. This is one of the clearest examples on this list of a real mechanism blown wildly out of proportion by content that skips the actual dosage involved. Iodine-fortified salt, widely used across most developed countries, further reduces the likelihood that typical goitrogen intake would ever meaningfully affect a well-nourished person. Spinach. Spinach is naturally high in oxalates, compounds that can bind to calcium and, in susceptible people, contribute to kidney stone formation. For the average healthy person, this risk is minor. Oxalates from food make up a small fraction of what actually determines stone risk. People with a personal history of calcium oxalate kidney stones are the group who genuinely benefit from moderating high oxalate foods. Cooking spinach reduces its oxalate content further, another case of a real compound treated as far more universally dangerous than the evidence supports. Pairing high oxalate foods with a calcium source in the same meal, like cheese or yogurt, further reduces oxalate absorption in the digestive tract. So, what's actually worth worrying about? The genuinely concerning items here: rice's arsenic, bottled water's microplastics, and mercury in large fish share something in common: manageable, well-documented risks with a clear fix. The most exaggerated fears, broccoli's goitrogens and spinach's oxalates, share something too: real chemistry, wildly disproportionate to the tiny amounts most people consume. The honest version of food secretly destroying your health isn't nearly as dramatic as the title promises, but it's a lot more useful than the version designed purely to scare you. If you take one thing from this whole video, read past the headline. The same pattern, real chemistry stretched into disproportionate fear, shows up constantly in food and health content.